The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the small apartment as Sarah rocked her newborn son in her arms. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, casting a golden glow on the only world she had ever known, a world that had just shattered into a million pieces. She stared blankly at the pile of unpaid bills on the kitchen table. Just a few weeks ago, Ethan had sat in that very spot, laughing as he planned their future. "Don't worry, love. We'll figure everything out." His words echoed in her mind, now cruelly empty of the warmth they once carried. There was no more we, only her. The funeral had been a blur. People came, whispered their condolences, and left. But Sarah remained frozen in time, clutching her son Jake against her chest, as if holding him tighter would somehow keep her life from falling apart. She had no job, no savings, just a baby who needed her, and a grief so heavy it threatened to crush her entirely. Still, she had hoped for one thing, that Margaret, her mother-in-law, would help. Ethan had always reassured her that his mother would step up if anything ever happened, but the moment Sarah knocked on her door, she realized how naive she had been. Margaret barely looked at Jake before crossing her arms. "Sarah, I'm too old to raise a child." "I already raised mine." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "I don't expect you to raise him. I need a little help, a few hours a day maybe, just until I find a job." Margaret shook her head. "I'm not a babysitter, Sarah. You chose to have a child. That was your decision. Now deal with it." The words hit her like a slap. Margaret wasn't just refusing, she was abandoning them. Sarah blinked back the tears burning her eyes. "He's your grandson," Margaret sighed, looking at her nails as if the conversation bored her. "And my life doesn't stop because Ethan is gone. You'll figure it out." Sarah stood there for a long moment, waiting for something, remorse, compassion, anything. But Margaret simply turned and shut the door. She walked back to her apartment, barely feeling her legs move beneath her. Jake whimpered in her arms, sensing her distress. She kissed his forehead, whispering, "It's okay, baby, we'll be okay." But the truth was, she had no idea how. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of reality only grew heavier. The bills piled up, and her landlord had already left 2 notices under her door. Every job application she submitted was either ignored or rejected. Companies wanted recent experience, not someone who had spent the last year at home caring for a baby. One morning, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the final shut-off notice from the electric company. Jake cooed in his crib, blissfully unaware of the storm closing in around them. Sarah exhaled shakily. She had no choice. She needed a job, any job. The classifieds were filled with jobs requiring degrees she didn't have or experience she lacked. Then, her eyes landed on a small ad. Furniture sales associate needed, no experience required. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number. A woman's voice answered briskly, "Yes. Hi, I'm calling about the sales position. Can you start tomorrow?" Sarah hesitated for only a second. "Yes." The next day, she stood in front of a large showroom filled with pristine furniture displays. The store smelled of polished wood and expensive upholstery. A middle-aged woman in a tight navy dress approached, her name tag gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Linda, store manager. Linda gave her a once-over, unimpressed. "You worked in furniture sales before?" "No, but figures." Linda sighed. "Just follow the others. Don't say anything stupid." Sarah clenched her fists. She was used to being overlooked now, but she couldn't afford to let her pride get in the way. The first few days were exhausting. Customers barely noticed her, and her co-workers weren't exactly friendly. Linda never missed an opportunity to remind her of her inexperience. "Let the real salespeople handle the big clients, honey. You just stick to stocking shelves." But Sarah was watching, listening, learning. She studied the customers, noting what they liked, what made them hesitate. She wasn't just there to work, she was there to survive. Then, one afternoon, a wealthy couple entered the store. The husband looked impatient, the wife overwhelmed. "We just moved," the woman sighed. "We have an entire house to furnish, and I have no idea where to start." Linda approached, flashing her signature fake smile. "I'd be happy to assist." "I'd rather just look," the woman interrupted. Linda's smile faltered. She turned to Sarah, irritation flickering across her face. "Fine, show them around." Sarah took a deep breath and did what came naturally. She didn't just point at couches and tables, she painted a picture. "Imagine a warm, inviting living room," she said softly. "Neutral tones with a touch of blue to bring in the light. A statement piece, like this oak coffee table, grounding the space. And in the corner, a cozy reading nook with a plush armchair, perfect for unwinding after a long day." The woman's eyes lit up. "That sounds perfect." The couple ended up purchasing an entire $20,000 furniture set. Linda watched in disbelief as Sarah rang up the sale. Her expression was unreadable, but Sarah didn't care. She had just proven she wasn't invisible. That night, she lay in bed with Jake nestled against her, a small smile playing on her lips for the first time in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, she was going to be okay. Sarah rushed through the store, balancing a clipboard in one hand and a price tag in the other. The morning had barely begun, yet Linda was already barking orders. "Sarah, the showroom needs to be spotless before Mr. Carter arrives, and don't mess up the display like last time." Sarah bit her tongue. She hadn't messed up anything. The display had been exactly how the client wanted it, but arguing with Linda was pointless. It had been a month since she started at the furniture store. The exhaustion had settled into her bones, but so had something else: determination. Every day, she absorbed everything like a sponge, learning how to sell, how to read customers, how to anticipate their desires before they even voiced them. But no matter how hard she worked, Linda never gave her credit. "She got lucky," Linda scoffed when co-workers mentioned Sarah's big sale. One sale doesn't make her a real salesperson. It didn't matter. Sarah wasn't doing this for Linda's approval, she was doing it for Jake. She glanced at her phone. Only 30 minutes left on her lunch break. The daycare bill was due tomorrow and she was still short. With a deep breath, she stepped into Mr. Carter's office. "Sir, I was wondering if there's any opportunity for me to take on more responsibility here." Mr. Carter looked up from his paperwork, surprised. "More responsibility? I want to learn more," she said quickly, "about design, about sales strategy. I know I don't have experience, but I'm a fast learner, and I think I could contribute more." Mr. Carter studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I like your ambition, Sarah. I'll think about it." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Later that afternoon, Sarah was restocking shelves when she overheard Linda on the phone. "Yes, the boutique client is coming today," Linda said, twirling a pen between her fingers. "She's looking for custom interior pieces. I'll handle it personally." Sarah frowned. A boutique client. That meant someone high profile, someone looking for unique, high-end designs. A sale like that could change everything. A few hours later, the client arrived. She was a striking woman in her late 50s, dressed in an elegant black coat and heels that clicked against the polished floor. "Mrs. Whitmore," Linda greeted her with exaggerated enthusiasm. "It's an honor to assist you today." The woman barely glanced at her. "I need something exclusive, sophisticated but warm, not cold and modern like the rest of these stores." Linda's fake smile faltered. "Of course, let me show you our best selections." Sarah watched from the back of the store, cold and modern. That was exactly what Linda was about to offer. She could already see the mistake happening. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. "Excuse me, Mrs. Whitmore," she said cautiously. Linda's eyes flashed with irritation. "Sarah, don't interrupt." But Mrs. Whitmore had already turned toward her. "Yes?" Sarah swallowed her nerves. "I think I know what you're looking for." Linda let out an exasperated laugh. "She's new. Ignore her." But Mrs. Whitmore ignored her instead. "Go on." Sarah led her toward a section that had been mostly overlooked. The handcrafted wooden collection. "Well, these are one-of-a-kind pieces," Sarah explained. "Hand-finished, with details that add warmth to a space. Imagine this walnut dining table, paired with cream upholstery to soften the look, a statement chandelier above it, balancing elegance and coziness." Mrs. Whitmore traced a hand over the wood, her sharp eyes scanning the details. This is what I was looking for." Linda's face paled. Within the hour, the sale was made, a deal worth over $50,000. "Mr. Carter called Sarah into his office that evening. "You have a gift," he said simply. "I'm promoting you. You'll now assist in interior styling consultations." Sarah blinked. "Really?" "You earned it," he said. "And Linda," he exhaled heavily, "she won't be bothering you anymore." The weight on Sarah's shoulders lifted just a little. That night, she rocked Jake in her arms, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "One step closer, baby," she whispered. "One step closer." The early morning light seeped through the curtains as Sarah adjusted her blouse in front of the mirror. The reflection staring back at her wasn't the same woman who had walked into that store months ago, desperate for a job. She looked stronger now, more confident, but the exhaustion in her eyes remained. She turned to the crib where Jake slept peacefully, his tiny fists curled against his chest. Every long shift, every moment of humiliation at the hands of Linda, every night spent worrying about bills, it had all been for him. And now, for the first time, she wasn't just surviving, she was moving forward. Her phone buzzed, a message from Mr. Carter. "Meeting today at noon. Big opportunity. Be ready." Her stomach tightened. A big opportunity. She had no idea what it meant, but she knew one thing: she wouldn't waste it. By the time she arrived at the store, a buzz of excitement filled the air. Employees whispered in hushed voices as they hurried to prepare the showroom. "Did you hear?" one of them murmured. "The owner of Whitmore Estates is coming back." Apparently, she loved Sarah's suggestions. Sarah's heart pounded. Mrs. Whitmore, the woman who had unknowingly changed everything. Mr. Carter greeted her with a firm nod. "Sarah, this is your chance to prove yourself. Mrs. Whitmore wants a full design proposal for one of her estate properties. If she likes it, this could be huge for us." A lump formed in Sarah's throat. Design a full estate interior. She had never handled anything of this scale before, but she forced herself to nod. "I'll do it." "You have 2 weeks," Mr. Carter said. "Impress her." The moment she stepped into the break room, she heard Margaret's voice. Sarah stiffened. She hadn't seen her former mother-in-law in months, and now there she was, sitting primly at a corner table, sipping her coffee like she owned the place. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice even. Margaret looked her over, her eyes narrowing slightly. "So, you're doing well now?" Sarah folded her arms. "Did you come here just to state the obvious?" Margaret sighed, setting her cup down. "Look, I know we haven't seen eye to eye, but times are tough. I thought maybe we could reconnect." Sarah almost laughed. Now she wanted to reconnect, now that she saw that Sarah wasn't struggling anymore. "You mean now that I don't need you?" Sarah said, shaking her head. "You made it clear before. I was on my own, and that's exactly how I got here." Margaret pursed her lips but said nothing. Sarah had no interest in giving her a second chance. Not now. For the next 2 weeks, she worked tirelessly on the design for Mrs. Whitmore's estate. Every night, after Jake had fallen asleep, she would spread out her sketches on the kitchen table, meticulously planning every room. The day of the presentation arrived, and Sarah walked into the meeting room with her portfolio clutched tightly in her hands. Mrs. Whitmore sat across from her, composed as ever, flipping through Sarah's designs. Minutes passed in silence. Then Mrs. Whitmore closed the folder and looked up. "And do you have talent?" Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, but Mrs. Whitmore continued, "Talent isn't enough. I need someone who can handle high-pressure clients, who can adapt to changes without losing their vision. Can you do that?" Sarah straightened her shoulders. She had survived grief, humiliation, and hardship. She could handle this. "Yes," she said confidently, "I can." Mrs. Whitmore nodded slowly, then turned to Mr. Carter. "And I want her to oversee the project." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. "Oversee the project." Mr. Carter smiled. "Then it's settled. Congratulations, Sarah." As she left the meeting, the weight of what had just happened hit her all at once. She had done it. She wasn't just an assistant anymore. She was leading a high-profile design project. That night, she held Jake close and whispered, "We're not just surviving anymore, baby. We're winning." This part delivers impact, builds tension, and moves the plot forward naturally. It also deepens Sarah's emotional arc while setting up an even bigger challenge. The cool evening air wrapped around Sarah as she stepped out of the office. The city lights flickered in the distance, mirroring the electricity coursing through her veins. She had done it, secured the biggest opportunity of her career. Balancing Jake on her hip, she unlocked the door to their tiny apartment, the familiar creak of the hinges greeting her like an old friend. She set him down carefully in his crib, brushing a soft curl from his forehead. "We're getting out of here soon, baby," she whispered. For years, this apartment had been their shelter, their safe haven, but it had also been a reminder of everything she had lost. Now, for the first time, she saw a way forward, a life where she didn't have to choose between survival and ambition. But success came with pressure. Mrs. Whitmore was a perfectionist. The estate she wanted to renovate was massive, a historic property requiring careful attention to detail. Sarah spent long nights reviewing blueprints, coordinating materials, and adjusting designs to meet the demands of her client. And the demands were relentless. "I don't want modern pieces cluttering the space," Mrs. Whitmore reminded her during one of their meetings. "It should feel grand, yet intimate. Classic, but with warmth." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. She knew exactly what she needed, but securing the right pieces was a challenge. Antiques, handcrafted furniture, textiles that carried history. Time was slipping through her fingers. The deadline loomed, and the weight of it pressed down on her shoulders. She couldn't fail, not now. Then, just when she thought she had a grip on everything, the unexpected happened. Margaret showed up at the store again. Sarah was in the middle of arranging fabrics when she saw her former mother-in-law lingering near the front entrance. Their eyes met, and for a split second, Margaret hesitated. "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her tone devoid of warmth. Margaret sighed, adjusting the strap of her purse. "I heard about your new position," Sarah arched an eyebrow, "and—" Margaret hesitated before speaking. "I was wondering if you might need a babysitter for Jake. You're working so much, and I—" Sarah's laugh was cold. "Oh, now you want to help." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I was trying to teach you independence." Sarah felt her blood boil. Independence. That's what she called abandoning them. "You left me alone when I had no one," she said, voice steady but sharp. "I begged you for help and you turned me away. Now that I don't need you, you suddenly care." Margaret looked away. "I made mistakes." Sarah exhaled, exhaustion laced in every fiber of her being. "Jake deserves love, Margaret. Not someone who shows up when it's convenient. Margaret's face twisted, as if struggling to find the right words, but there was nothing left to say. Sarah turned her back and walked away. There was no room in her life for people who had abandoned her. The days leading up to the estate's unveiling were brutal. Sarah barely slept. She balanced meetings, last-minute changes, and ensuring every piece fell into place. There was no room for error, and then, finally, the night arrived. The estate glowed under the soft evening lights as Sarah stood by the entrance, heart pounding. Mrs. Whitmore arrived precisely on time, her sharp gaze scanning every detail as she stepped inside. Silence. Sarah held her breath as the older woman walked through the rooms, running her fingers over the carefully curated pieces. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Whitmore turned to her. "You have exceeded my expectations." Relief flooded Sarah's body. "This is your talent," Mrs. Whitmore continued. "You don't just design spaces. You create homes." Sarah blinked back tears. "Thank you." Mrs. Whitmore nodded. "I'd like you to take on another project, a personal one." Sarah's breath caught. "Another project? I'm purchasing another property. I want you to handle it from the ground up, no oversight, just your vision." Sarah could barely process the words. This wasn't just a promotion. This was the moment everything changed. That night, she didn't just whisper to Jake about a better future. She knew they were already living it. The rain drummed softly against the window pane as Sarah tucked Jake into bed. His small fingers curled around hers, his sleepy eyes barely able to stay open. "Mommy, are you still working tomorrow?" he mumbled, his voice thick with exhaustion. Sarah stroked his hair gently. "Yes, sweetheart, but I'll be home early, I promise." Jake yawned and snuggled deeper into his blanket. "Okay, but don't forget to bring me a new bedtime story." A soft smile played on her lips. "I won't." She watched as his breathing evened out, his tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. He was her everything. Every long night, every difficult decision, it had all been for him. And now, after everything, their future finally felt secure. But despite her success, something unsettled her. She had spent years pushing forward, fighting to carve a space for herself in a world that had turned its back on her. Now, standing on the precipice of something great, she found herself wondering, was it enough? Mrs. Whitmore's latest project was unlike anything Sarah had worked on before. A sprawling mountain estate, designed to be a sanctuary of beauty and comfort, but this time, it wasn't just about impressing her client. It was about proving to herself that she belonged. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the estate site before sunrise. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. She had full creative control. Every detail, every decision, it was hers to make. She stepped into the skeleton of the house, inhaling deeply. The potential was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows, exposed beams, a grand stone fireplace at the center of the living room. It was the kind of home that held warmth, that told a story, but not everyone believed she was capable. As she reviewed the construction plans, one of the site supervisors, Greg, crossed his arms and smirked. "You sure you can handle this?" he said, barely masking his skepticism. "This isn't some cozy little furniture store gig. This is a real build." Sarah met his gaze, unflinching. "And that's exactly why I'm here." Greg chuckled. "Just saying, it's a big project. Maybe you should stick to decorating." She refused to let his words shake her. She had come too far for this. Instead, she dove headfirst into the work. She supervised every material selection, oversaw every intricate design choice, and negotiated with contractors to ensure the project stayed on schedule. As weeks passed, the estate began to transform. Every piece of the puzzle started to fall into place. but the pressure only grew. Deadlines tightened. Suppliers fell behind, and no matter how much progress she made, Greg's doubt never wavered. Then one evening, after a particularly exhausting day, she received a call she never expected. Margaret. Sarah hesitated before answering. "Hello?" There was a pause. "I was hoping I could see Jake." Sarah's grip on the phone tightened. Margaret had disappeared after their last conversation. Now, suddenly, she wanted to be involved. "He's fine," Sarah said, keeping her voice neutral. "I know I don't deserve it," Margaret continued, her voice quieter now. "But I'd like to try." Sarah sighed, her heart tangled in a storm of emotions. Could she trust her? Did she even want to? "Let me think about it," she finally said, then hung up. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the estate site, her mind still clouded by the conversation. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice Greg watching her from across the lot. "You're early," he commented. "So are you," she shot back. Greg exhaled, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Look, I might have underestimated you." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "This place," he gestured toward the nearly completed house, "it's turning out better than I expected. You know what you're doing." It wasn't much, but coming from Greg, it was practically an admission of defeat. The estate was finished 1 week ahead of schedule. When Mrs. Whitmore arrived for the final reveal, Sarah felt her pulse quicken. The older woman moved through the space slowly, taking in every detail, the warm tones of the wood, the elegant yet comfortable furniture, the soft lighting that made the vast house feel like a home. Finally, she turned to Sarah. "This is extraordinary." A breath of relief escaped Sarah's lips. "You've built something remarkable," Mrs. Whitmore continued, "and I think it's time we talk about your future." Sarah's stomach flipped. "What do you mean?" "I want you to continue working for me, but not just as a designer," Mrs. Whitmore said. "I want you to lead my entire design division, oversee all my estate projects." Sarah's world tilted. She had imagined growth. She had dreamed of more. But this was beyond anything she had ever allowed herself to hope for. Later that night, she sat on the couch with Jake, his little fingers tracing the patterns on a book she had picked up for him. "Mommy, are we going to live in a big house one day?" he asked sleepily. Sarah kissed the top of his head. "One day, sweetheart, one day." And for the first time, she knew it wasn't just a dream, it was a promise. The golden hues of the late afternoon sun bathed the estate in a warm glow as Sarah stood by the enormous windows, watching the trees sway gently in the breeze. This was it, the pinnacle of everything she had fought for. Mrs. Whitmore had made her an offer most people could only dream of: head of the design division, full creative control, financial security beyond anything she had ever known. It was everything she had wanted, yet something held her back. She glanced at her phone, hesitating before dialing Margaret's number. "I thought about what you asked," Sarah said once the call connected. Margaret was silent for a moment before softly saying, "And you hurt me," Sarah continued, her voice steady. "You left me when I needed you the most, and I don't know if I can ever forget that." Margaret exhaled. "I don't expect you to." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of years of anger and disappointment pressing against her chest. "Jake is still young. If you want to be in his life, you have to show up for him. No more disappearing, no more conditions." Margaret swallowed hard, her voice thick with something almost foreign. "Remorse. I'll do whatever it takes." Sarah didn't fully believe her yet, but she was willing to give her a chance. Days passed in a blur of meetings, contracts, and planning for the next chapter of her career. Everything was falling into place. Then, one evening, Mr. Carter called her into his office. "You've done something remarkable here, Sarah," he said, leaning back in his chair, But I have to ask, do you really want this? Sarah frowned. What do you mean? You've spent years proving yourself. But I wonder, are you still proving something to the world or to yourself? She opened her mouth, then closed it, because for the first time, she wasn't sure. That night, she sat at the kitchen table long after Jake had fallen asleep, staring at the contract Mrs. Whitmore had sent. A part of her had always believed success meant proving everyone wrong. But now, looking at Jake's peaceful face, she realized she didn't have to prove anything anymore. She had already won. The next morning, she made her decision. Instead of walking into Mrs. Whitmore's office, she walked into Mr. Carter's. "I'm grateful for everything," she said, "but I want to build something of my own." He smiled, as if he had expected it. "Then go build it, Sarah." Months later, she stood in front of a small, charming storefront. A sign above the door read, "Sarah & Co. Interiors." It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't a multi-million-dollar estate, but it was hers. And as she stepped inside, holding Jake's hand, she knew this was just the beginning. As Sarah stepped into her new store, feeling Jake's small hand in hers, she knew one thing for certain: she had won on her own terms. But what about you? Have you ever had to fight against all odds to rebuild your life? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. If you enjoyed this journey of resilience and triumph, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story. Your support helps this channel grow.